A routine pizza delivery takes a chilling turn when a young courier notices something unusual about an elderly woman he regularly serves. Driven by concern, he steps into her home, only to uncover a troubling mystery. What he finds will leave him no choice but to take action. Will his instincts be enough to make a difference? Subscribe for more gripping stories. And let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Noah's shift was winding down, the humdrum of pizza deliveries easing as he glanced through the remaining orders on his screen. His mind was already on the end of his shift, finally time to rest after a long night on the road. But then he noticed something odd. Mrs. Ellison, one of his regulars, hadn't placed her usual order. Mrs. Ellison was more than just a customer to him. She was a sweet, elderly woman with a soft voice and warm smile. Someone he looked forward to seeing on his rounds. Every evening, she'd call in for her favorite pepperoni pizza and garlic knots, joking that it was her only guilty pleasure. Though the conversations were brief, they held a comfortable familiarity. Tonight, however, her absence was like a missing piece in the rhythm of his evening. Noah tried to shrug it off. Surely, she just didn't feel like pizza tonight. But a nagging feeling gnawed at him, and he found himself pulling back into the pizzeria and ordering her usual. Maybe she forgot, he told himself, though the thought didn't ease his concern. By the time he arrived at her street, the neighborhood was dark and still. The usual porch lights were off, including Mrs. Ellison's, something that set his nerves on edge. She always left it on. She'd mentioned once that it made her feel a little less lonely in the evenings. A cold sense of unease took root as he parked his car and made his way to her door. Mrs. Ellison, it's Noah, he called softly, knocking a bit louder than he intended. After a long, stretching silence, he finally heard faint footsteps, and the door creaked open just a sliver. There stood Mrs. Ellison, but her appearance sent a chill down his spine. She looked nothing like the cheerful woman he remembered. Her skin was pale, her eyes hollow, and her usually neat gray hair was tousled. Her hand, wrapped in a white bandage, trembled as she clutched the door. "Noah," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" "I brought you your usual," he said, trying to keep his tone casual. "Thought you might have forgotten to call in." Mrs. Ellison's face twisted, a look of regret mixed with fear flashing across her face. "That's very kind of you, Noah, but," she trailed off, glancing over her shoulder as though someone were lurking in the shadows behind her. "I'm not hungry tonight." Noah's worry deepened. He could sense her hesitation, her guarded posture, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. "Are you sure? I just wanted to check in. You don't look well." A long silence hung between them. For a moment, he thought she might open up, but then her face hardened. "Thank you for your concern, Noah, but I'm fine. You should get home." He hesitated, unsure if he should push further. But as she slowly closed the door, he knew he couldn't just leave. Her fearful gaze, the uncharacteristic mess inside her house, it all painted a picture that was too troubling to ignore. Noah returned to his car and sat in silence, eyes fixed on her darkened house. The pizza box sat untouched beside him, filling the car with the scent of pepperoni and garlic. But it did little to calm his nerves. "Maybe I'm overthinking this," he muttered, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. But then he thought about how lonely Mrs. Ellison had seemed, and how she had trusted him with little details of her life. No, he couldn't brush this off. Deciding he needed more information, he drove to the nearest neighbor's house, hoping someone might shed light on her situation. An older man answered the door, looking puzzled to see a pizza guy at his step so late. "Sorry to bother you," Noah began. "I deliver to Mrs. Ellison regularly, and tonight she seemed different. Have you noticed anything odd?" The man scratched his head, his expression darkening. "I haven't seen her in days. Usually, she's out walking every morning. But now that you mention it, she hasn't been out lately." His frown deepened. "She's a tough lady, but maybe she's not doing as well as she lets on." Noah's heart sank. He thanked the man and moved to another neighbor, a younger woman who answered with a steaming mug of tea in her hand. She listened with a concerned frown. "Actually, yeah," she said slowly. "A couple of nights ago, I saw two men hanging around her house. They looked like they didn't belong there, knocking on her door, whispering to each other. I thought about asking if she was all right, but I didn't want to be nosy." Noah felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. Strangers lurking around Mrs. Ellison's house was a bad sign. He moved to the next house, hoping for more answers, and there he found an older man who gave him a grim nod. "I've seen those two fellas too. They've been coming around a lot. Hanging on her porch, knocking on her door. I told them to get lost last week, but they didn't seem too happy about it." Noah clenched his fists, his worry transforming into a determination to protect Mrs. Ellison. She had become more than just a delivery stop to him, and he couldn't bear the thought of her facing these men alone. Taking a steadying breath, he returned to her house and found the front door slightly ajar. His pulse quickened as he stepped inside, calling her name softly. "Mrs. Ellison?" he whispered, moving further into the dimly lit hallway. Papers cluttered the small table near the door, overdue bills, a few prescriptions scattered around. Finally, he reached her bedroom door. Slightly open, he stepped inside and found her slumped on the floor, looking frail and helpless, her breathing labored. Noah rushed to her side. "Mrs. Ellison, what's going on? Are you hurt?" She looked at him, her gaze weary but relieved. "Noah, I told you not to come in," she whispered, her voice cracked with exhaustion. "I couldn't just leave," he replied, steadying her as she tried to sit up. "Why didn't you tell anyone what was happening?" Her lips trembled as she glanced away. "Because no one would listen. They'd just think I was a confused old lady." "No, they wouldn't," Noah said firmly. "Tell me what's going on. Who are those men? They keep coming, telling me to sell the house," she murmured, her voice quivering. "They say they're here to help. But, when I said no, they got aggressive. They're trying to scare me out." Noah's blood boiled. Vulnerable people like Mrs. Ellison shouldn't be treated this way, especially in their own homes. "I'm not leaving you here alone," he said, helping her to her feet. "We're getting you out of here." But before they could move, a loud knock sounded at the front door, and Mrs. Ellison's face went pale. "They're back," she whispered, clutching his arm in fear. "It's all right," he whispered back. "We'll go out the back." With his arm around her for support, he led her quietly through the back door and into his car. He drove to a nearby motel where he knew she'd be safe for the night, his mind racing with the need to protect her. When they arrived at the motel, Noah helped Mrs. Ellison inside, settling her into a chair as he pulled out his phone. He called a trusted friend who worked with elderly support services, explaining the situation. Within minutes, his friend promised to bring in legal help and security for her house, making sure those men wouldn't bother her again. The next morning, Noah sat with Mrs. Ellison as they met with the support team. He could see relief settling over her face as she realized she wouldn't have to face this alone. Over the following days, he watched as a security system was installed in her home. Locks were changed, and supportive neighbors rallied around her. Soon, Mrs. Ellison had a home nurse visiting regularly and a legal team protecting her property. Noah continued visiting, bringing her pizza and spending time as her friend rather than just her delivery guy. They shared meals, laughter, and stories of her younger days, their bond growing deeper with each visit. One evening, as they shared a quiet dinner, Mrs. Ellison smiled softly. "You saved me, Noah," she said, her voice choked with gratitude. He took her hand gently. "Mrs. Ellison, you've been a friend to me too. I'd do it again in a heartbeat." As the days passed, the harassment faded into memory. Thanks to Noah's determination, Mrs. Ellison found a sense of peace and belonging, knowing she wasn't alone. And for Noah, this experience wasn't just about doing the right thing. It was about realizing the profound difference kindness could make in someone's life. Noah had protected her when she needed it most, and in doing so, had changed both their lives forever. Kindness, he realized, was sometimes all it took to change everything. Thank you for watching. If you were touched by this story, don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss our next one. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you.